Hey everybody, welcome back. Good to see you guys. I see we got about 7 of us here so far. So good evening, and yeah, just going to take about 6 minutes or so, and then we'll get rolling with tonight's lecture. Good afternoon / evening. Good to see you, Rachel. Hi there, Yijia. Oh, look who's here. It's Peachy. Hey everybody. Hi Dewey, Sierra, Gabriel. Yes, Princess. Oh, how's the Lakers doing? I'm teaching right now, so I can't really watch the game. Let me see the score. I figure that, Houston can't stop them, but they did win game 1, so you don't know. I'm looking 57-41. Oh yeah, halftime. It's not an insurmountable lead, so you have to come out and put it away in the third quarter. How do I feel about instruction being online for spring? Did they make an announcement yet or no? Pinky, watch out. No, I'm curious, Gabriel. Did they make some announcement about that or no? I'm just curious. I have no knowledge about whether there has been or not. Are you just asking, like, hypothetically, would I prefer or not prefer if it's in person in the spring? Well, it's a complicated question. I wouldn't want to do anything if it's not safe. I wouldn't want to do anything that puts even like one person at risk of getting this virus. So in that sense, yeah, I would prefer that it stays online. But I mean, pedagogically, there are some, I guess, like educational benefits from in-person instruction, but can't teach a dead person. So I mean, it's better, I think, for everyone to take the most risk-averse policy until we have the thing under control. And in my mind, we're not going to get it under control until we have different policies, because we have to have a nationwide federal mandate, federal lockdown. Like, we have to reset. We have to do what we should have done at the beginning. Now it's too late to have an effective first response, but we're going to have to basically, I think, if everybody like really stayed inside, like for real, and like just wore masks when they went outside for like 6 weeks, this virus would be pretty much dead, because it would lose its ability to transmit, and all the people that are in the strict quarantine would have, either gone to the hospital because their symptoms got too bad, or they would recover. And then when we all re-emerged after that 6 or 8 week period, there's nobody transmitting the virus, because all the existing cases have either been hospitalized or they recovered while they were in quarantine and couldn't pass it to anybody. I mean, this is something that other nations understand and that they have done. So whether it was just poor planning or not enough contingency planning, or not enough, it's hard to fully appreciate the reasons. But yeah, we let our guard down, and now we got a bigger problem. So I do think that the lockdowns are going to be probably necessary for public health reasons, but it's going to get very I think it's going to get very ugly after the election, because you're going to have one of two outcomes. You're going to either have, I think if Biden wins, he's going to have policies that ask us to stay in, and there will be locked down a little longer, but we'll make progress against the virus. If Trump wins, I think he's going to like basically get on a mission to open everything up regardless of what the risks are. And so we'll basically like march back into all these big public institutions with not enough protection, and there will be a lot of people that'll die. Oops, I don't know what to tell you. It's not a pretty picture. But me, with my own personal health, I don't know. I feel like I'm in the best shape of my life, so I think I've got a good chance against whatever happens. But I have a lot of concerns. It's a dangerous situation. I'm going to follow the scientific public health guidance. Yeah, I mean, I miss being in the classroom though with you guys, if that's what you're asking. Like, of course, I think that that's where I should be, and that where we should be, but not at the risk of our health and safety. It's weird though, not having all the trappings of public life. I mean, I used to go to a lot of concerts and shows. I used to play shows and stuff. So not being able to go see live music is kind of weird, but those things don't matter as much as human life. So yeah. AMC reopening with $5 tickets. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to go to the theater for a little while. The last movie I saw was Joker. ironically enough. And, you know, I was looking forward to seeing some movies this year, but right now it's just at home. I have a nice home theater though, so it's not too bad. I did watch Bill and Ted. I really like Joker. I know that, I mean, it received a lot of critical acclaim, but I know that there were some people who felt that its dark aesthetic and themes were a little off-putting. But to me, I thought it really captured the spirit of the times. I thought it was a genius movie and a brilliant performance. I thought Joaquin deserved the best actor for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Just one man's opinion, you know. Okay. All right, just a few seconds, and then I'll be getting us started here. Hello, everybody. See all you guys. Really good to check in before our weekend. Okay, it's 5:30, so welcome back, everyone. Appreciate all you guys' attendance. Let me, just because I'm looking at our numbers and stuff, they'll probably jump up a little more as the first few minutes of class pass by. Sometimes, as a backup, I send this announcement to everybody, like, hey, class is happening, here's the link. But just while we're all here right now, just understand that it's, unless otherwise noted, it's always going to be the same. So I just do that kind of as a reminder for your convenience, but just don't think that, for example, if I didn't send a message like I did not do so today, that means there's no lecture. There's always lecture Tuesdays and Thursdays, 5:30 to 6:45. It's going to be right here. And the only exception to that would be if I tell you, oh, we're going to switch over to Zoom for like a review session or something. And in that case, I would give you an email notification. But anyway, hopefully you guys all subscribe to the channel, and so when I go live, you get a notification anyway. All right. So yeah, let me just recap some of the big things from last time, and then we'll move forward in our notes. I'm going to distribute the paper prompts for you guys this weekend. They're not due until 2 weeks from Monday, so you'll have a lot of time to work on them. But I'm tweaking one of the wording on one of them until tomorrow. So I'm going to release it tomorrow in the morning or afternoon, and then we'll talk about it at the top of the meeting on Tuesday. So you'll have, you know, a good amount of time, more than 2 weeks to work on it. But if you want a little more guidance, then you can hang on to the prompt and then attend the Tuesday meeting, and then we'll talk about it at the beginning of the Tuesday meeting, the prompts, okay? So everything's going according to schedule with our calendar and everything else. That's just a reminder. So yeah, we started this class by talking about the philosophy of religion, and the first major argument that we reviewed was the ontological argument, which is the one about God being the greatest conceivable being by definition. And so Anselm, the author, said that's what the definition of God is. Everyone knows that, and it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality as opposed to just only the mind. So based on his definition and based on it being greater to exist in both, the greatest conceivable being then exists in both, and he can't even be thought not to. And atheists who say that they don't think he exists, they must be thinking of something else, because that's not even possible, because he's too great to be thought of as not existing. And hi, Alexander, to you too, and Sophia and others. Okay, so then there were the objections to him. Not to worry, AJ, it's all good. So yeah, the objections to the ontological argument, we had a trio. There was Gaunilo, Moore, and Rowe. I'm going to be very brief about it, but Gaunilo just said, okay, well, what about if I make up an idea of the lost island, the greatest conceivable island? You know that doesn't exist, but Anselm's logic would imply that it does, so he must be wrong, or at least his logic is faulty when he tries to prove that something must exist if the idea of it is greatest conceivable. And then there was Moore. Moore said existence is not an attribute, it's not a predicate. If it's not a predicate, then it makes no sense to say a perfect being has to have that quality, because when you break it down, it's not really a quality of anything. To show it, he displays these two groups of sentences when on the one hand there's existence, and on the other hand there's a predicate, and the existence sentences don't all make sense. And then there was Rowe, who said that defining something as existing doesn't really prove that it exists. If it did, then I could just define anything and make up a word as existing blank, and then claim that I just proved it existed, but that's ridiculous. Suppose I make up the word magic hand and it means existing magician. Okay, well, there is David Blaine and Harry Houdini and those guys, but if there weren't, then the word would still mean existing magician, and there wouldn't be any. So if God means existing being that's perfect, and that's the definition, Sure, I mean, let that be the definition, but that doesn't mean that there has to be something that does exist that corresponds to the stated definition. I gave you an alternative example, which was the unicorn example. Unicorn meaning existing unicorn doesn't prove anything. If there's no such unicorns, like there aren't, then the word still means existing unicorn, but so what? There's no such things. So when a word is defined as existing, that's not proof of really existing. It just means exists according to the definition. Okay, now, after that we turn the page to the cosmological argument, right? I would love it if anybody could tell me the brief basics of that. What's the cosmological argument? What is going on with it? You don't have to give all the facts or details, but what's the big picture? Like, how does the cosmological argument work? What's going on there? It's trying to say, okay, here's the proof that God exists, but what proof do they give? They say, what's the logic behind the conclusion that God exists, according to the second argument? So put something out there for me, and then whatever you have, I'll work with it. Like, what does, yeah, everything has a cause, good, Ronald. And God's a necessary being, yeah, that's also a part of the argument. God is the cause of the universe. There are two truths. Okay, a lot of these are good and correct elements of the overall argument. So let me put them all together one last time for us. He starts with this thing about a sphere. He says, suppose you're walking in the woods and you saw a sphere, which is not a normal thing to see out there, right? And he says that would lead you to, at least for a moment, think, like, what's that doing there? How did that get there? What's the cause that, like, led to it being there? And that is an illustration of the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason just expresses that whenever something's true, there's got to be a cause for it. So the sphere, if it were a real experience you had of seeing something like that, you'd ask or think, what's the cause? And according to the principle of sufficient reason, it has to have one, even if you don't know what it is. Now, after that, there's this mention of there being two types of truths. There's contingent truths and necessary truths. Contingent truths are things that are true, but they didn't need to happen. Like, for example, you're watching this lecture right now, true. But I guess if you had, I don't know, been doing something else with your time right now, then this viewing attendance by you would not have happened. So it's true, but it could have happened differently. Trump's election, Toronto Raptors winning the NBA championship, dinosaurs going extinct, you know, those are things that happened, but if events had played out just a little differently, then they might not have happened. So contingent truths. Then there's necessary truths, which are things that are true, but they couldn't even possibly be false. So that's stuff like math, like 2 + 2 is 4. You know, the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Things that are formally true based on just like pure concepts and ideas. So the contingent truths have to have a cause. That's what the principle of sufficient reason says. Next, we are pointed out to the fact that the universe exists, which is obvious. The universe exists, and in the argument, it's claimed as something that's contingent. So since the universe exists, this is a true fact, it's a contingent truth. There has to be a cause for it. And that's where the argument kind of gets to the conclusion. What could be the cause of the universe? Well, the universe can't be its own cause. Also, the universe can't be caused by something contingent, because that just leads to an infinite regress. And so the only possibility is that the universe's actual cause is something that's not contingent at all, but is necessary. And that means God is the cause, because God is, you know, thought of as a necessary being, something that is independent of everything else, but everything is dependent on him. So, like, as the dominoes of cause and effect go back and back and back into the past, the initial link in that big chain of cause and effect is God, the self-moving, unmoved mover that causes everything else. Everything results from him, everything issues from him, but he stands independent. Okay, and then we did talk about the design argument. Something, a purpose or a function, it had to have an intelligent creator. Can you remind me, what was the example that William Paley used to start his paper? He said, if you came across this thing in the woods, or really wherever, but he uses the woods. If you came across this in the woods, you would know that it had to have, yeah, the watch. Good. So the watch is the chosen example of Paley. Paley says to see a watch is to see something that displays marks of complexity and architecture. It's something that had to be made by an intelligent being, because it's created with a purpose in mind. It's created with the purpose of all the little gears turning just so that the hands will indicate the time of day. And a watch could never have come about through a random process, through just chance or whatever. So take away from the watch example, thing like a watch with a purpose or function has to have a creator that's got intelligence. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. And he says there are many things that would not really cause a person to doubt or deny that the watch had a maker. Suppose that you don't know how it works, or that you've never seen a watch being made, or suppose that there's some flaw with the watch. These are none of these are legitimate reasons to disagree that the watch has a maker. And nobody would instead suppose that the watch just came about from randomness or like, you know, elements just somehow banging into each other and through pure chance and luck creating a watch. That's just not reasonable. So the claim is that when there's something with a purpose or function like a watch, all the little carefully arranged parts, they had to be put together with some kind of intelligence and, that started it. So that serves as an analogy. The next thing he says is that there's things in nature like the eye or the ears or the nose or anything that serves a function within nature. They must have had an intelligent designer or creator as well. And that, of course, would be God, the architect of nature. So that argument is tracing the existence of God from the evident fact that there are things like us, you know, that can see and talk, and that there are all kinds of things in nature that also have adaptations to their environment which enable them to perform various tasks. So they must be created in the same way like a watch. That means there's a creator of nature and it's God. Okay, so after that we had gotten to the work of Ernest Nagel. And I was just going over his objections to these various arguments with you last time. And I think we did cover the big three. So I told you his problems with the cosmological argument, right? Like he says, for the first point, why does everything have to have a cause? But if it does, how come God doesn't have to have a cause? On the other hand, if everything has to have a cause, why aren't we saying God needs one? Doesn't that contradict? And furthermore, last point is that maybe an infinite regress is not actually impossible, since the argument of the cosmological argument says it's impossible, so God has to be the first cause. Nagel is questioning that. He says maybe there's a possibility that there could be an infinite series of causes, and if so, then there's no need to assume there's a first one at all. Okay, and then the second reply he gave was to the ontological argument. He just kind of borrows the same idea from Moore, which is that existence is not an attribute. And I tried to walk you through you know, his problems with the idea that existence is an attribute. He gives the example of a $100 bill, and he says, if you have it or don't have it, the definition is the same. I gave you a little different example. I said, take the case of dinosaurs. The definition of them is the same, whether they exist or whether they're extinct. So existing or not has nothing to do with the defining qualities of something. And that's the point that he's making. That's discrediting the ontological argument, which treats existence like it's a quality of something. Brooklyn, when you're writing, why wouldn't God have a cause? I guess you're just chiming in, right? Or are you asking that as a question? I think that I see you chiming in and offering some answer to the previous little line of thought. Yeah, okay, good, thank you. So then the third argument that he disputes is the design argument, and he has two big points to say against it. Number one, the only real reason he thinks that we can say for sure that the watch has a maker isn't so much because it has a function. It's because we make watches, and therefore we know that we're the creators of them. Not because they have a function, but because we make those watches. After that, he says, if you want to try and explain the existence of function in nature, though, you don't even have to suppose that it comes from intelligence. It could come from evolution and the process of natural selection, which is pretty justified according to empirical evidence. So he says there's a better explanation for how nature gets the function. And when you're talking about watches, the real reason we know they have makers isn't even about their function. So the analogy of the watch and the eye, he thinks, kind of falls apart. Okay, that is where we left off. And now I'm going to go ahead from there, a little review to start the meeting, to talk to you about the end of Nagel's article. So there's like a couple just little extra pieces at the very tail end. He discusses two additional miscellaneous arguments for God's existence after he tries to dismiss the big three that I just talked about. So I'm going to put the title of this note here as like miscellaneous arguments for God's existence, kind of like a grab bag of extra arguments that have not achieved the same prominence as the other three, but they still do have some appeal and some that follow these arguments. So 2 other miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. Okay, now one of them, it doesn't have like a handy title, I guess, as some of the others do, but I'll just invent a name. It's the idea or argument of the unfairness of the world. So the argument from unfairness. So it can be briefly stated. It's basically this idea that if God did not exist, then the world would just be too unfair, and therefore there has to be God. So God must exist. Now, in my own mind, this is not the highest quality argument for God's existence, because there are, I think, some pretty self-evident problems that come about right away when you just think about this argument. But let me try and explain it really fast, and then I'll tell you what Nagel's critique is. So this world we live in, quick question, okay? Which I guess has a kind of obvious answer, but let's just put it on the table. Do bad things ever happen to good people on this planet? Do bad things ever happen to good people? Does that happen? Like things that these good people don't deserve. You know, they did nothing wrong. They don't deserve to suffer. So, but something bad still happened. Sure, and everybody knows that. You're all saying yes, and 100% of us, I think, understand that, right? We don't have to point out all the examples, but there's almost too many to mention. People have died in concentration camps. You know, little children have been gunned down at school. You know, right now there's a lot of people dying off from the COVID-19. That didn't really do anything wrong, of course. So bad things can happen to good people. That's just something we can't deny. On the other hand, let me ask another question. Can good things ever happen to bad people? Can there be bad people doing bad things, but they're living their best, well, I don't want to say best life, but they're enjoying their life. Like they are, they're not finding any unhappiness. Sure, so there could be good things happening to bad people, right? I mean, have there ever been like serial killers and stuff who went to their grave without ever being caught and felt like they were pleased with their life? Sure, there have been. So good things can happen to bad people and bad things can happen to good people. Hopefully that's not the most typical case. You know, hopefully we think people get their just desserts at least sometimes in life. You know, good things, virtue gets rewarded and vice gets punished or something. But it doesn't always work out that way, correct? So now, what would be something that could make that could balance that out? That could restore justice for those who have suffered in life but they were good people, or for those who've prospered in life but they were bad people? What would be a mechanism that could rectify and right those wrongs, if there were such a thing? What do you think? Heaven and hell, good, right. So if God exists, yeah? Well, usually you say authority, but I'm asking a different question. I'm not asking what could right the wrongs in the world they're living in, because I'm giving you the hypothetical where they pass on to the grave and they never faced either benefit or burden, depending on which case I'm talking about, right? So like the whole death at the hands of a murderer, a bad person who died with a smile on their face because they never faced any accountability in their life, okay? So we're not able to talk about the case of, oh, they get caught and punished, or they get saved and benefited. So you guys, Brooklyn and Ashton, yeah, we're talking about the concept that if there were God, right, then what he could do to even this out is that in the afterlife, the virtuous person who suffered would be rewarded with a heavenly reward. And the vicious person who prospered would be punished with a hellish afterlife. So that, you argue, could make things fair, right? Of the people who suffered in life but were good human beings, you could say God has got the reward waiting for them. And for the bad people who prospered throughout their life and never faced any harsh penalties, God would be the one to serve justice to them after they died. Now, if God exists, then the apparent unfairness that we see in our lives would be restored to justice in the afterlife. And so what Kant and some others, this is a philosopher's name, Immanuel Kant, he's one guy who argued for this argument. They have argued that, well, there has to be God, because if there wasn't, it would just be so irredeemably unfair. Bad people could prosper and they would never be punished. And good people could suffer and they would never be rewarded. And that just wouldn't be fair. It would be like good people don't get anything for being good, and bad people don't get anything bad for being bad. So there has to be a God, because if there weren't, this unfairness would never be canceled out in the afterlife, right? That's the argument, but we're talking about Nagel, who's going to criticize the argument. So what do you think? I think the criticisms of this argument are easy to point out, but what do you think they could be? What do you think could be the main criticism of this argument, if anything? It says there's got to be God, because if there wasn't, then the world would be just so unfair. How do you think one could challenge that idea or argument? Or maybe you're convinced. You're like, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it can't be that unfair, so there's got to be a God. Ricardo, you're saying it is. Let me make sure I'm trying to follow your comment. It is unfair. Okay, yeah, so you could just say the assumption that the world is fair is just an assumption. It's not something that you can claim as a known truth. So what you can say is that we don't know that life is fair. In fact, haven't you heard this said to you 100 times by like your parents and people? I don't know why. It sounds like a cynical comment, but I've heard people say, like as a truism, life's not fair. Get used to it. Like, what am I supposed to do with that information though? Just like cry or get sad? But anyway, people say life's not fair. This argument is saying, no, it actually is. It's just that only after it's over does God give everybody what they deserve, either punishment or reward. But just because the world would be more fair if we assume that God provides divine justice is not really enough to actually prove it. So the author Nagel says this sounds more like a description of a person's hopes and dreams than something that's proved based on evidence. The argument basically is saying if God existed, that would be a way of making this universe fair in the afterlife. But if we don't think that it's necessarily fair in the first place, then there's no essential proof been given. Okay? AJ, you say, it is to talk about balance. There can never be too much of good or too much of bad, almost meet at a point in which the world becomes balanced. I don't know. I mean, maybe. But the thing is, it would be better if it was more good than bad. I mean, if it's balanced, it's like 50-50. Are you like going off of like a yin-yang kind of idea? Like there's the dark and there's the light. I mean, we want to have more good than bad. So I'm just saying, like, we shouldn't necessarily concede to the idea that evil can't be eliminated. Evil is something we just got to deal with. But we're looking at this argument. So the argument is really just saying God's got to exist to be the one who restores justice in that afterlife. If he weren't there, then there would be no mechanism to give that justice out. But the argument, again, as Nagel sees it, is weak because it's assuming that the world is fair, but it's not able to make a proof of that. And it runs contrary to a lot of people's common sense, which has been drilled into you since a kid, that life's not fair, so don't expect it to be fair. Here, I'll read to you what Nagel himself said about this, so you can hear his words. Don't take it from me, take it from him. So he says this. Yeah, again, I'm finding the part here. So yeah, here's where he describes the argument. He says, Kant was aware that though virtue may be its own reward, the virtuous man does not always receive his just deserts in this world. Nor did he shut his eyes to the fact that evil men frequently enjoy the best things that life has to offer. In short, virtue does not always reap happiness. Nevertheless, the highest good is the realization of happiness equal with one's virtue, and Kant believed that this is a practical postulate of the moral life. So he assumes there must be God. But now Nagel speaks and says, Oh, well, no, he's continuing to describe it. Well, what can guarantee that this is possible? Such a guarantee could only be found in God, who must therefore exist, if the highest good is not to be a fake ideal. But as he criticizes it, he says, despite the prestige this argument has gained, it's difficult to give it any credibility. It's easy enough to assume God's existence, but assumption has all the advantages of theft over honest work. No assumption carries with it any assurance that what is assumed is really the case. And although we may postulate God's existence as a means of guaranteeing the possibility of realizing happiness together with virtue, the postulation does not establish the actual ideal nor the fact of his existence. So he says it sounds just more like a person stating what they hope to be true, not what they've really proven. Of course, we all hope that this would be a perfectly just universe, and that virtuous people would gain reward and vicious people would be at least reprimanded. But projecting that hope is not the same as saying you proved that it's real. Okay, so that's one more argument along with his dismissal. And then last but not least, there's one last, I say two miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. So that was the first one. Here's the second. He calls it the argument from mystical experience, but I'll just call it the argument from religious experience to be a more general label. So let me just try to explain to you what this argument is. I find that it's actually this one's pretty easy to grasp. And if you actually ask everyday people, at least some people, why do they believe in God? Some of them will give you this as the most common response. Okay, so what do you think is a religious experience? Anybody have an idea about what that word or term refers to? Religious experience. Going to church, being baptized? Not exactly, but I see where you're coming from. Praying. Brooklyn, you saying visions? They're all in the ballpark. Let me now try to bring these things together. Like an awakening, kind of like that, Priscilla, yes. It's based on the notion of having feelings that are very powerful. So let me kind of give you the overall brief description here. Yeah, it could be a person thought that their prayer was fulfilled. There's many ways it could manifest. So let me explain the basic idea. Near-death experience could also be one. Sometimes if you ask a person, why do you believe in God? Their answer will be, well, because I had an experience. I had a religious experience, and after that, I was convinced that God definitely exists. Now, what could be the content of the experience? There's many possibilities. It could be they thought something miraculous happened in their life, like somebody or maybe they themselves recovered from some terrible illness or narrowly avoided death. It could be that they were out in nature and they had like a transcendental moment where they felt like God's presence was made revealed to them. It could be that they thought they heard God's voice speaking to them while they were deeply engaged in prayer or meditation. So in whatever way it plays out, a religious experience that a person claims is a feeling of some kind of vivid connection to the reality of God. Like after that experience, they refer back to it when they ever are asked why you believe in God, you know? So it could have been a near-death experience. It could have been like some type of feeling of unity with nature. It could have been a presumption that their God is speaking to them, or provided them with a sign of some kind, you know, at some auspicious time in their life. So, you know, you can fill in the blank. There's not just only one possible kind. You know, maybe one guy is out meditating. Maybe another person, you know, fell off a motorcycle and like had a brush with death. Somehow, against all the odds, they survived. You know, lots of things could have happened that fit the bill. Okay. Anyway, that's the type of argument here. But Nagel, once again, criticizes this. Yeah, so that's a good description, Dante. An experience where you feel like God is the reason it happened or something, or just the presence or the being of God somehow became. What's the criticism of this argument? Well, what he says is that the problem, first of all, is that it's based on evidence that cannot be shared. Okay, so suppose that you're skeptical of God, like an atheist would be, and someone tells you, "Here's my argument. I had a religious experience, so God exists." That's my argument. From the skeptic's point of view, who didn't have the experience on their own behalf, are they going to just assume that this is a true report? Or are they going to be like, okay, well, they said it, so God must exist. No. I mean, to the skeptic, there's always going to be a way of explaining these reported experiences that has nothing to do with God, right? So, like, what do you think could a skeptical person say they think is the truth of what happened to the individual who claimed the religious experience, without attributing to them like, oh, they're just lying about it? What do you think maybe a person could believe was the real event that happened? Right? Like, what could be a natural explanation? Someone could say coincidence, right? Someone could say luck. I get the feeling that when you guys say coincidence and luck, you keep thinking about the like, he almost died, but then he pulled through. It's not just that case, though. It could just be like a person thinks God's talking to me or something, like nothing dangerous happening. So yeah, Brooklyn, you could say it's their psychology. You could think that they had a very powerful psychological episode which made them think that they were experiencing God, but what was really happening was they were losing touch with reality, becoming insane. Maybe they're on a bunch of drugs. Maybe they were like delirious from like sleep deprivation or post-traumatic stress, or maybe they were having an emotional, psychological breakdown, a chemical imbalance in their brain. So you could give all these alternative explanations that are based on just natural phenomena to try and explain their reported experience. And there's not going to be any way for them to prove otherwise because they cannot give you the experience themselves, right? That's the thing. Experiences are private to the person who had them. So, the argument lacks persuasive power when you're talking to another person who hasn't had the same experience, right? You could talk about it all day, but if they haven't had the experience, then there's nothing that you can do to show it to them. Objective evidence is usually evidence that you can present to other people so that they can examine it independently. But if you're saying I had an experience, that's locked away in your memories and in your own psychology. So it's not available for anyone else to look at. So that's another problem with the type of evidence. So 2 problems. Number 1, the experience cannot be shared. And number 2, there are alternative explanations for the claimed experiences. Now, look, maybe the person did have a religious experience. Maybe they really actually, like God revealed himself to the person. But we're asking about how effective this is as an argument. What's the point of an argument? It's to convince people who don't already agree with you. So if a person who believes in God talks to another believer and is like, why I believe in God? Because I had a religious experience. The other person will be like, oh, right on, high five, me too, but they agree with each other. The point of making an argument would be, I'm talking to someone who doesn't agree. I'm going to try and make a case so that they'll come to agree with me. But if you're talking to a person who hasn't had the experience, then there's nothing that they can examine or use to verify the claim. And furthermore, there are going to be ways to explain it away without us accepting that it's legitimate or authentic. So that's why it lacks persuasive power. The only people that you would want to convince would be people who don't already agree with you. But to any such person, by definition of their atheism or whatever, skepticism, they haven't had such an experience. And since you can't give it to them, and since there's other ways to explain that it happened, it's not going to compel their belief, right? Now, from there, one more thing of Nagel's article at the end. So what we've looked at so far in this class up till now have been these arguments that God does exist, and then objections to the arguments. But we have not looked at any single argument which tries to make the case that there is no God. And there are definitely arguments that try to establish or in some way justify that God does not exist. So we're going to look at just one of those, which Nagel mentions here at the very end of his paper. So this is actually a very classic argument that goes back thousands of years. It's always been a kind of, I would say, like a little thorn in the side of the church, because it's, among all arguments, it's one that I think has caused many people to question religion or their faith. But we're going to have to talk about it too in our time. So this is the problem of evil. So that's what the argument has been called, the problem of evil. So it's not, again, as with Richard Taylor, it's not as if Nagel, writing in the 20th century, is the original creator of this argument. It goes back thousands of years, but he presents it in 1959 in this paper. So it's a simple argument in a way, even though it's quite deep, but it can be simply stated in just a few premises and then a conclusion. So here's the way the argument goes. Sometimes when we write arguments out in philosophy and in logic, we write them in a precise form, which is called standard form. The standard form of a logical argument is to place the conclusion at the bottom underneath a horizontal line, and then the premises above that line. Now, just a word on terminology. The conclusion of an argument is the statement that you're trying to prove, that you're trying to argue for, that you're trying to demonstrate that it's true. Okay, that's the bottom line at the bottom of the argument. The premises listed above are the reasons or evidence that are supposed to back up and support the conclusion. So in every single argument, there are some premises that lead to a conclusion. The premises are the evidence, and the conclusion is what they're supposed to be proving. So here's this problem of evil argument. Two premises, I'm going to number them here, and then the conclusion below. So the first premise says that if God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. So if God existed, then in that case, there would be no evil in the world. Okay. Second premise just simply says, but there is evil in the world. So let's see if you can deduce the conclusion here. It's a simple act of deduction. What follows from the two premises? I think you can probably see where this is going. Well, no, that's already on the second premise. It says the second premise already says evil exists. The conclusion is different from the second premise. So what do you think it is? Let me repeat the two. If God did exist, there would not be any evil in the world, but there is. So therefore, yes, God doesn't exist. That's the conclusion of the argument. Now, just a little extra word about the terminology that we use when we make arguments in logic and in philosophy. When you reach the conclusion of the argument, we infer it from the premises, and we say a conclusion indicator word right before the conclusion. Yeah? So as you read it out or write out the argument, it would be spoken as follows. If God existed, then there would be no evil in the world, but there is evil in the world. What do you think is a conclusion indicator word that would go right before saying the conclusion? I see already some of you have put it in the chat, but now let's tunnel vision in on that. What is one conclusion indicator word that I could say before I state that conclusion? Good. Therefore is one of them. That's probably the most well-known. Also, the word so is another one, exactly. And let me just show you how both would work. If God existed, then there would be no evil in the world, but there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Or we could use the term so. If God existed, then there would be no evil in the world, but there is evil in the world, so God does not exist. There's also hence. Ronald, you saying that means? Kind of, yeah. But it's not, I think, one of the canonical classic examples because there's a little ambiguity. That means could sometimes be giving a definition, whereas this is implication. But it's a subtle distinction. I don't want to make much of it. There's also thus. So therefore, thus, hence, so, consequently, all of that, and on all of those, okay? So just giving you a little familiarity with the kind of language and terminology that people use. If God existed, there'd be no evil in the world, but there is, so God does not exist. Now let's go through the argument one more time and think about the steps. Premise by premise, line by line. So that first premise says if God existed, there'd be no evil in the world. Why do you think anybody would make that claim? What is it about God and what is it about evil that you would think those two things would not go together? If there really was God, there would not be any evil. Why do you think someone would suppose that? What is it about God that a person might believe would prevent evil? What about God is contrary to the existence of evil? Well, yes, exactly, Brooke. The number one is that he's perfectly good. So a perfectly good being that would not like evil. Evil is contrary to good. So a perfectly good being would want things to be good. But there's also this other thing. Not just that he's perfectly good, which is one part of his definition, but also on top of that, he's claimed to be, you say it, Madison, all-powerful. Yes. So think about those two things. If he's all good and all-powerful, an all-powerful being can do anything they want, right? Because they're unlimited with their power. So if God wanted to and he exists and he's all-powerful, then anything bad happening, he could stop it right now, just because that's God's will. On the other hand, it says he's all good. So if he's all good, he has a motivation to stop evil. So a being that's perfectly powerful can do anything, and a being that's perfectly good wants to do good. So you would think that on those two bases, God would not allow for evil. He would stop it with his awesome power because it's something that goes contrary to goodness. Now, but of course, evil does exist. That's what the second premise says. And we've kind of already touched on that in today's meeting, and it's something that's impossible, I think, to deny. There's evil things that happen. You know, look at the Holocaust. Look at some of these terrifying school shootings with little kids and stuff. You know, look at, I don't know, a cancer diagnosis in like a really good young person that was not doing anything wrong. So people get tortured, raped, genocide. I mean, everything you can imagine happening under the sun. So there's evil in the world. First premise says, but there shouldn't be if God really exists. So the conclusion of the argument is there must not be God, because if there was, there wouldn't be an evil, but there is. So that must mean that there's no such thing as God. Now, that's the argument, and it's been a very powerful argument over the centuries. You know, some people, you can imagine, right? Like, you have a loved one, a dear loved one, and they just suffer the worst death ever for no good reason, and you're like, man, this universe just seems to be chaotic and not governed by a perfectly good being, because why would he let that happen? But there are objections to the argument too. Just as we've talked about objections to the theist arguments, there's objections to the atheist argument here. Maybe you can even think of, in your mind, what could be said against this. Is there anything that you think of? Brooklyn, you say free will. Okay, I know what you're saying, and we'll talk about that. So let me go over your suggestion here. I think what you mean with your brief comment is, well, God, yeah, there you're saying more that man can be evil because God granted us free will. But the thing is, doesn't God already know, though, how people are going to act? Like, because God's perfect, he's omniscient, right? So he's all-knowing. Therefore, wouldn't he know that people would inevitably commit actions that would be evil? And why then give us the ability to do those things? On the other hand, and here's another reply that I think I could give to your suggestion, is that you go back to the Bible story. I mean, go back to Genesis. According to the story of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, prior to the fall of man, when Eve ate the apple from the serpent, it was paradise, you know? Why couldn't God have just allowed that to persist? Why did he have to provide the temptation to Eve, knowing full well that she would definitely eat the apple? Why did he have to allow the serpent to even occupy the garden? Furthermore, you know, so having free will is not the same thing as necessarily having to do evil things. I can imagine living like me, or probably all of you, knowing that you could do evil things, but just not wanting to. I'm free. I have free will. But the thought of, you know, doing bad and evil things disgusts me. How come people couldn't have had the theoretical ability to do evil, but they just don't want to? I think that would be fine, and God, you know, could have created the world such as that. You know, we could have had a world where people even make fiction about doing bad things. They watch movies where people are getting killed, but no one's ever actually done it, you know? So I don't see why the actual existence of evil has to be a precondition of us having free will. Do I believe that God exists? I don't know, maybe. I mean, it just depends. Sometimes I think so, sometimes I don't know. but I got a lot of time to figure it out or think more about it, I guess. What about you, Gabe? Do you think God exists? It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I kind of grew up in somewhat of a religious household at first, my grandma, but then later in life, I spent a lot of time growing up with my uncle, who's an aerospace engineer, who develops weapons defense systems for the U.S. government and intercepting missiles that could be fired at us from our enemies and stuff. And so, like, he's all about physics and very secular, and he's kind of not believer. So I've had both influences in my life, really, and I therefore think that I have an open mind. I believe that if God does exist, he's going to be just, and that means that he's going to treat people fairly, whether they declare that they believe in him or not. In my mind, it's an open question, and it's something that's really fascinating to ponder. The cosmological argument makes me think maybe, but there is a lot of evil out there too, so it's just hard to say. I'm kind of maybe undecided. Yeah, so back to the argument though. I'm just going over what could be objections. One of them is kind of like what Brooklyn, you have said, that God grants us free will, which allows us the possibility to commit evil actions. So it's not really due to him wanting there to be evil. It's due to him giving us the gift of free will, which we can act according to our will. But I find that there's still ways of pushing back against that, right? Like, free will is compatible with not actually doing evil things. I'm sure you guys understand that you have the free will in a sense to like kill people, but you would never do it, right? So how come there actually have to be people who take those actions that they are at least capable of taking? Yeah. Another objection to this is something that maybe some of you have thought, and I think some have suggested, which is that it's not really evil in the big picture, because being able to overcome the trials and tribulations and struggles that we have in life gives us a greater sense of purpose, and therefore these obstacles that we perceive as evil are really all for the best. It gives us something to overcome and to strive to move past. So maybe that was the plan of God, allow for there to be some exposure to negative things so that we value and prize the good side of things even more. Like people, there's no light without the dark and all that stuff. But according to Nagel, that's not the best objection, because it sounds to him like you're saying that evil is just an illusion. And if you could take a step back and see it from the God's eye view, you'd see that everything's for the best. So all the tragedies and harms that people suffer, God has a plan, and it's all going to work out for the best in the end. You just can't see all the mysterious little aspects of the plan. But Nagel says this in reaction to that. He says, first of all, even if it's just like apparent evil, even if it's just the illusion of evil, even that is bad and not ideal. So suppose there's someone like on death row right now waiting to be executed and they didn't even do anything. Of course, there have been cases like that, right? If you poke your head in on death row and you're like, don't worry, I know it's terrible for you, but it's all for the best. God is up there, and no matter what happens, it's all for the best. It's going to be cold comfort to that person, right? They're not going to be like, oh, okay, that makes me feel better. So even the appearance of evil, even if it was somehow vindicated or justified in some larger scale picture of things, is not for the best, according to Nagel. And then the last thing he says is, isn't it speculative to say that also? Why would a person say that when you see evil, don't worry, it's just an illusion? It's because they hope for that. They hope that the evil that we see is just an illusion and everything's for the best. But you could just as well flip it around and have the opposite assumption, a very cynical, negative assumption, which is that good is just an illusion. And the universe is governed and ruled by the most evil being possible, so that he's just setting you up to believe in goodness so that he can harm you more by crushing your hopes and dreams later. So why is it that you will choose to believe that evil is an illusion and everything's for the best, instead of believing that good is an illusion and everything's for the worst? It's only because the first thing is more pleasing and the second is scary. So how can it be that you're offering that as a rational basis for the belief in the force of the argument? Anyway, just another little examination of an argument bearing on the existence of God and the back and forth of how objections and replies could be stated after that. So we're done with that whole article then by Nagel now. And that gives us the time to start talking about the next author in the list, which is quite interesting. So this is going to be the last argument given for the belief in God. After this, we have a couple more essays on the whole topic, and then they're not about trying to prove that God exists, but they're sort of like critical next week. So we're getting closer to the end of this first unit of the class. But one more author who's trying to make the case that you should believe in God, and that's this French philosopher from the 17th century. His name was Blaise Pascal. the Blaise Pascal, let me open the notes that I have here to him really fast. He lived from 1623 to 1662. So he had, kind of a short life, I guess, about 40 years, but it was very impactful. Let me tell you a little bit about his biography from the book here. Yeah, so he was a French academic. He was a mathematician, a physicist, and a philosopher of religion. So he actually was a very learned person and well-versed in a couple of different academic disciplines. He wrote this book that was only published posthumously after he died. So it actually came out in 1669, even though, of course, he wrote it during his life. But we don't know the exact dates since it was published after his life ended from notes that were then gathered. But in 1669, the book called Pensées was published by Pascal. And that's a French word that means thoughts. Thoughts. So the book Thoughts, or in French, Pensées, from 1669. Within that book, he writes the argument that's been come to known as the wager. Famously, it's often just called Pascal's wager today in reference to his last name. So that's what we're now going to look at. The Wager by Blaise Pascal, 17th century French philosopher, scientist, and physicist, and from his book, Pensées, 1669. The Wager, Pascal's wager. Okay, so this is an interesting approach because it's a little different from our other authors that have tried to make the case for God. Whether it was Anselm or Taylor or Paley, they all try to directly prove that God exists. They're trying to prove that God exists, but Pascal starts off and he takes things in a different direction. He says, actually, I'm not going to try to prove God exists because I don't think it's possible to prove that. He says, when you think about it, it would actually be foolish to even try to prove it because God, if he exists, he's so far beyond our human comprehension. Because, if God exists, he's an infinite being. He's a divine being. And here we are. We're just finite, limited individual intellects. So if that's the case, then God, being so far beyond us and beyond our powers of judgment and comprehension, we would never be able to prove that he exists. That would be a fool's errand, according to Pascal. And that's why he actually says that when, like, a skeptic challenges the theist and says, tell me your proof that God exists. And the theist kind of shrugs their shoulders like, I don't know, I can't really prove it. Some skeptics will ridicule that response, like, haha, you don't have any arguments, so you're clearly just being irrational and foolish. But Pascal tries to defend that position. He says, look, it actually makes perfect sense that they don't attempt to give an argument because in a way they're wise enough to know that attempting to do so is just a foolish endeavor that can't possibly be done successfully since the concept of God is beyond our ability to understand. So he says, I'm not going to do that then. I'm not going to try to prove he exists. Instead, I'm going to try to make the case that it's to your best interests to just go ahead and believe in him, even though you can't prove he exists. Okay? So he's not really so much arguing for the proof of God's existence as for the wisdom and the self-interest of just believing in him, whether you can prove it or not. Okay? So from that, now I'll read a little bit of it so you can hear how he put it. He said, right away at the beginning on page 48, if there is a God, he's infinitely beyond our comprehension. Since being indivisible and without limits, he has no relation to us. We're therefore incapable of knowing what he is or whether he is. That being so, who would dare to attempt an answer to the question? Certainly not we, who bear no relation to him. Who then will condemn Christians for being unable to give rational grounds for their belief, professing as they do a religion for which they cannot give rational grounds? Some declare that it is foolish to expound to the world, and then you complain that they don't prove it. But if they did prove it, they wouldn't be keeping their word. It is by being without a proof that they show that they are not without sense. Okay, so having said that, he now makes the case that you should look at this as kind of like a wager. You should look at the situation of whether to believe in God or not as taking a bet on one or the other side of like a coin flip. Okay, so he says, let's consider for a moment an example. I want you guys to think about the example of a person who wagers on the flip of a coin. Okay, so With a coin flip, what do you know is going to happen when the coin is flipped? If this is a normal heads and tails coin, then for sure what's going to happen after you flip it? It's going to land, and it's going to be what? It's got to land either heads or tails, correct. Now, before the coin is ever tossed, you know it's going to come down one of those two ways. But do you know which way it's going to come down? Of course not. That would be like already knowing in advance what the result is, and it can't be known until it happens. So you know it's 50-50, one of the two, but there's no way for you to determine which one. So let's say that you wager on one of those two sides of the coin. It's kind of like the proposition that's being put to you, whether you should believe in God's existence or not. And here's the similarity, okay? With the question of whether God exists or not, just like with the coin flip, there's two outcomes that are possible, right? What are the two outcomes? In this case, it's not heads or tails, but it's what or what. You're being asked to make a choice, not to pick heads or tails, but on this bigger question that we're really focused on, you have to choose between what two things? Now I'm switching the example from the coin to this whole matter of the belief in God. And so by comparison, we human beings have to make a choice between believing in God or not, exactly. We have to believe in God or not, and like the coin flip, we don't know in advance what's the real outcome going to be. Is it true that he exists or is it not? It's like the heads or tails. Is it going to be heads or tails? You are not going to know until the coin lands. For now, you just have to kind of wager and see what happens. Now, he says, we know this for sure. We don't know if God exists or if he doesn't, but we know for a fact that he either exists or does not. So this is like his first main point. We know for sure, we know for certain that either God exists or does not exist. We know that it's one of these two either-ors. This is in logic called a disjunction. Either statements are called disjunctions. So if I say to you, I'm either going to watch the lecture or watch the Laker game, that's a disjunction, which has these two disjuncts. Disjunct 1, I'm going to watch the lecture. Disjunct 2, that I'm going to watch the Laker game. Now, with this particular disjunction, it's the case of either God existing or not existing. In the case of the coin flip, it's either landing heads or tails. And in both of those two examples, we don't know right away, according to him anyway, we don't know right away which of the two disjuncts it will be, but we know that it's going to be exactly one and not the other. Okay, we know when the coin is flipped, it could be either side that lands, but when it lands, it's going to be either heads or tails, and it won't be the other. Same here. We don't know right now, I guess, according to him, whether God exists or not, but we know that it's a fact that either he exists or he doesn't exist. It can't be that he does and doesn't. It's exactly one of those two and not the other. So he says the position you're faced right now with is being asked to wager on this question like wagering on the coin flip. But there's a little difference with this wager about God, because he says it's a forced wager. It's a forced wager. That means that you have to take a choice, whether you believe or don't believe. That's a unique aspect of this so-called wager, because most wagers in like real betting, you don't have to take a bet, right? So like suppose that I come up to you with a coin. It's a weird example, but I come up to you with a coin and I'm like, yo, here's a coin. I'm about to flip it. Bet. Make a bet with me. What do you think is going to be, heads or tails? Now suppose you don't like betting and gambling. What could you say to me when I come up to you and I hit you with this proposal? What's it going to be, heads or tails? Take a bet. I'm about to flip this coin. What do you say? Give me your bet. If you don't like all that betting, what can you say to me right now? You could say not, right? Exactly. You could say, I'm sorry, but, well, Brooklyn, I'm trying to give a different case. Like, heads is taking one of the two positions. But anyway, suppose you don't like betting. Then you could say, no, I'm not a betting man or woman. I don't want to bet. I'm not interested in taking the position, heads or tails. So just go ahead with your coin. I'm going to mind my own business. But here, though, Ronald, I understand, it'd be a little weird out of the blip. Yeah, if you don't betting, you could just basically refuse, is all I'm saying. Makes sense. But on the case of this wager, he says you can't get out of that. You can't say, look, I don't care about this question, God exists or doesn't. I'm not going to take one or the other view. I can't take either view because I don't want to. He says, for better or worse, this wager you can't get out of, because suppose that you say, I'm not going to take any position. I'm not going to say I believe. I'm not going to say I don't believe. The way that Pascal sees it is that that is just the same as betting for what? If you say, I have no view on this, I'm not going to take any stake. I'm not going to stake out any position. If you take no bet, it's the same basically, and you're going to be treated the same as a person who doesn't believe, correct? So in case God exists, Pascal is saying that he's going to treat those that say, I don't believe in God, the same as people who say, I don't know, maybe, maybe not, I'm not going to choose. So, yeah, it's a forced wager because you're either going to make a choice to believe or not believe. And even if you make no choice, that's like choosing to go with the non-believers. So if it's a forced wager, as he claims, then there's only one question left. What's the safer bet for you? You got to make a bet. You got to pick one of the two sides. So what you want to do is take the bet that is the least risk and holds out the best chance of reward, right? So let me show you why he thinks then choosing to believe is just the safer bet. Maybe it's already making sense to you, so you're gonna have no difficulty with what I'm about to say. But I want to kind of make it very, very clear. So let me show you a little. It's kind of like a little game theoretic diagram. Sometimes they call these a Punnett square, where you showcase the possible benefits that can come or the losses that can come from a given choice situation with a few different outcomes and a few different choices you can make. So here's a box. Okay, and I'm going to create a quadrant of 4 boxes in set. So it's like that, 4 boxes. Now, here on the top 2 vertical columns, I'm going to put the 2 ways that we're going to first start by talking about the coin flip wager. And then I'm going to switch the example to the real example we care about, which is God. So in the coin flip, what are the 2 possible outcomes of the flip? One outcome is that it could, when you flip the coin, that it could what? It could land heads, right? So land heads. That's this column. And the other possible outcome is obviously tails. So over here, lands tails. Now on the 2 left horizontal rows, I'm going to put the 2 betting options. So what's one way of betting in the actual coin flip? One way is that you could take the choice to choose what? Easy enough, but I just want to kind of keep you engaged. So you could, on the one hand, choose to what? You could choose heads, okay? Or obviously the alternative, you could choose tails. So that's here. Now, what you see at this point is this grid, and there's 4 boxes within the grid. Now, each box connects a betting stance with a outcome of the coin flip, okay? And so in each of the boxes, we're going to show what would happen. Would it be a win or a loss if that combination of bet and outcome resulted? So suppose one chooses heads. So I'm looking at this box first. So what does this box represent? This box represents the combination of choosing heads and it lands heads. Is that a win or is that a loss? This box. The box which stands for having chosen heads and heads came up. Is that a win or a loss? That's a win, exactly. So that's a W right there. You chose the heads and that's what came up, okay? You won the coin flip bet. But there's 3 more possible combinations, right? Each box is a combination of an outcome and a betting position. So that's one of the 4 possible combos. Well, here's another one. You chose heads, but it landed tails. Is that a win or is that a loss? Let me know. Top right box. That's a loss. Good. You chose heads. You're looking at a tails, so you lost. Over here, you chose tails. Heads was the outcome. Yeah, sorry about that. But anyway, you chose tails and it landed heads. What about that? Win or loss? That's an L. That's a loss. Good. And then, so obviously you see the last one. You chose tails and boom, tails came up. That would be a win. Okay, now, just looking at this grid, all I'm trying to show you is that with a 2 outcome betting situation, where there are 2 optional stances to take, that gives us 2 ways to win and 2 ways to lose. You can win by choosing heads if heads turns up, or you can win by choosing tails if tails lands. Or you could have lost if you have a mismatched combo in either way. So having chosen tails and it lands heads, that's an L. That's a loss. And if you chose heads and it landed tails, that'd be loss too. Now, what I'm going to do next is we're going to erase this grid, and we're going to now try to go through the same process of analyzing the stakes, the risks and rewards that could happen if we make this be a wager, as Pascal calls it, about whether to believe in God or not, okay? Okay, so here we go with a new box. Now, okay, so this is the big wager, the real, the real tough one. We're talking about God, believing in God or not, and God existing or not. So what's one of the two outcomes of this wager? It could turn out in the end that, in fact, what? Outcomes are going to be the vertical columns. Betting stances are going to be the horizontal rows. So starting with this, one outcome is God did exist, okay? So it could be that that's the way the so-called coin lands. It's a 50-50 for you at this point in terms of what you know, but maybe that's how it turns out. Now, of course, the other possible outcome is that there was no God after all. God does not exist. Okay, so now over here, we're going to talk about the two choices that you have with this wager, as they call it. So it's not choosing heads or tails, but you, I think, follow me. What's one of the choices in this wager? A person could go with what choice? To believe or to not believe. Perfect, right? So one way of going is I believe in God. And the other one is does not believe in God. Okay, so now we're just going to game it out. Like, what are the different possible outcomes here, or the combination of outcome and betting stance? What would be the results? So we're going to go box by box. Say one believes in God, and actually God does exist. Is this a win or a loss? The top left box we're talking about here. Would that be a win or a loss? It's a win, yes. But I have even more question about it. Well, subtle little extra follow-up. What would be one, though? What's the jackpot? What's the payoff? What you say it's a win, but what do you win? It's a big W, yes, but what is the actual thing that you win? Well, that what you believe is right is a little minimalist, don't you think, way of putting it? I mean, according to the doctrines that people, I guess, believe, or some believe, is that you get a heavenly reward. You're going to go to heaven, right? So if you believe in God and God exists, Pascal anyway, and a lot of religious tradition would argue that's what God wanted. He just wanted you to believe in him, so you did. He exists. You're going to go to heaven when you die. So that's heaven. Now, that's a big win. How good is heaven supposed to be? Any thoughts about that? Like, how good is it to go to heaven? According to your thought about it. Very good, yeah. In fact, I mean, it's hard to imagine just the concept of it, anything being better, right? Because the way that it's described is infinite happy life, like fully maxed out, as much happiness as you could ever have for eternities. I mean, that's about as good as it gets, right? So I'm going to put, it's positive, like a plus sign, but I'm going to put the infinity symbol there because it's like the best. It's like infinite win. So, like when you win like a jackpot or something, if you're gambling, you get like some amount of money. But this is more than anything, right? Because it's the most life and the most happiness possible forever, to eternity. So that's plus infinity. All right? But we got some other outcomes to still work on, right? So like next up, suppose that the person believes in God, but actually there was no God. So is this a win or is that a loss? Top right box. Believer, but we assume, let's say, for sake of discussion, that there wasn't God actually in the end. So that's a loss, yeah. But what is lost? What's the loss? It's not a win because you didn't get, your position was incorrect in that hypothetical case. It's a loss. You say nothing at stake, Brooklyn, and I kind of understand what you mean because it's like, well, there's no punishment for you. It's not like you lose anything in that sense. But some might argue that, you had to give time and energy to believing in religion, and if it wasn't really true, then you could have argued, oh, well, I wasted some time and energy in the practice of the religion and in the way of adhering to it. So it's not a big deal. Most would probably say there's nothing to lose at all. And I can side with that, but maybe just to kind of give a little lip service to the possible judgment of others, it could be that you lose something, but you just lose a little time and energy, like some time and energy. Like all the time that you spent reading the Bible, going to church, in that example would be like a waste of time and a wasted effort because there was no God to reward it in the end, I guess. Now, but there's two more cases. Say that a person didn't believe in God. So that's their view, that's their wager. But oops, they were wrong and there was a God. Would that be a win or a loss? Didn't believe, but God was real. So first thing I'm asking, is it a win or a loss? And yeah, it's a loss. But what's lost in this case? I mean, what is the loss? How bad is it? Now, there's a couple of things you can say. It's definitely a loss. It's not winning the wager at all. Now, Brooklyn, you say hell. Yes, the most traditional descriptions from a lot of the theology that we're aware of in major world religions of monotheism, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they say that to the non-believer, there's a punishment in hell. Other people, some don't believe in the doctrine of hell, even though they believe in God and religion. So some say it's not hell, but it's something like at least you're in purgatory, you're denied the reward of heaven or something. So whatever the view is, it's either eternal damnation, okay, which there can't be anything worse than that, pain and misery, gnashing of teeth, fire and brimstone. You've heard the descriptions in the Bible probably. Forever. That's negative to infinity. And even if it's not quite hell, being deprived of the infinite happy life in heaven is also kind of an infinite loss. So this would be like a loss to the infinite degree. But there's one last case. So imagine a person didn't believe in God, and they're right. As it turns out, there really wasn't. So we call this a win or a loss. Didn't believe, and you're right. So nominally, yes, it's a win. But what has been won, if anything? Like, what is the big payoff jackpot in this case? It's sort of just the reverse of this, I guess. It's like, maybe it's nothing at all, or maybe it's just having a little bit of extra time, energy, and freedom to not be practicing religion in your life. So it's either nothing or something small. So we can say positive, like plus, you won a little bit of that extra time and energy. Okay, so now the fully stated breakdown of the matrix of options and outcomes has been put on the board. So looking at that and thinking about it from Pascal's viewpoint, what do you believe he's going to say is just the better, safer bet for any person who wants to avoid risks and potentially gain benefits? It would be the best policy and choice to believe. Okay, good, yeah. That's what I've asked, but let's see if any of you guys could just say like a sentence or something about like, well, why though? I know it's kind of obvious, it's getting obvious, right? But why would it be the safer bet, the safer wager to just go ahead and just choose to believe in God? Why would that be better than not believing? Based on what we've gone through here, you can just say it to me. It's obvious in a way, but let's make sure we can understand it and I get it back from you. Why is that the better bet? I'll definitely say it for you with the last few minutes if you can't get it out. I know we're running low on time, but okay, Gabe, you're saying it's the only one that you actually win something. Well, you could lose if God doesn't exist, but the thing is, it's about how much is lost or won, kind of. Andrea, you say because it'd be better to lose time and energy than eternal damnation. Yeah. So the loss here is not so bad, but the loss, if this is your choice, is extreme. Definitely true. You don't risk your life by believing. Well, you don't risk your soul if it does exist by believing, but you do place that if it exists at risk by not believing. Yes. Better to gain or lose nothing than it is to lose. Yeah. Brooklyn, you say because if he does, you'll spend eternal life in hell, and if he doesn't, nothing else happens. Right. So let me bring all those comments together. Sierra, because you'd have a better life with God. Well, that's not so much been what's claimed, because it's not about the nature of the life that you're living while you're alive. It's about the punishments and rewards that are capable of being given to you after you no longer are alive, either on the assumption that God exists or on the assumption that he doesn't exist. Here's the way I think you should think about it. He says it's better to believe because you have a lot that you could gain and you're not even risking that much. But on the other hand, if you choose not to believe, you're taking a huge risk, and even if you're right, you don't have much to gain. So like if there's two bets that are available to you, and one has huge risks with low rewards, and the other available bet holds out the possibility of huge rewards, but you're not even risking much, why would you take the riskier bet rather than the safer bet? He thinks all it takes for a person to agree with him here is not some like deep-seated religious convictions, but rather just aversion to risk. If you don't want to take chances on going to either hell or being locked out of heaven, you can just prevent against that by choosing to believe in God. And even if you're wrong, it's kind of like, so what? Being wrong doesn't really bear much cost. But choosing not to believe is to make a choice where being wrong is extremely dangerous and being right holds not much benefit. So like in a coin flip, if I say, hey, pick heads or tails, but here's the stakes. If you pick heads and you win, I'll give you infinite money. But if you pick heads and you lose, I keep the quarter. Or like, I'm going to take 25 cents from you. If you pick tails and you win, you get to keep the quarter. But if you pick tails and you lose, I'm going to put you in a dungeon and torture you for the rest of your life. Now, look at those two options. Heads, you can win infinite money, or you can lose a quarter. Tails, you can win a quarter or be tortured forever. Why would you take the tails bet, which doesn't offer you much in terms of winnings, but exposes you to huge losses, when you have the heads bet, which doesn't expose you to great loss, but holds open the possibility of an infinite reward? So, that's his argument anyway. It's an inventive and a clever argument, but there are also some objections to it as well. So for now, I know we're out of time, but I'm glad that we were able to cover all of this material and finish with Pascal today. Yeah, you could just say live life on the edge. I mean, there's more to say. There's more to say. I don't want anybody to think this is a closed case. We're going to open it back up and talk about what some criticisms can be. But for now, I'm happy with the discussion. Are you guys good? Let me know if you are. If everything's good to go, I guess we'll close for now. You can hit that like button or just let me know in the chat. Or if you have a last-minute question, you could let me know. All right, I think we're good to go then, guys. So I appreciate everybody. Have a great night. Have a good weekend. Yes, I'm going to email the paper prompt. Thank you, Danny. I'm going to email that, I think, in the morning because it's I still have to get my dinner and stuff tonight, and I've been doing notes all day. But I'm sure you guys want to probably take it easy and retire and get your night going tonight. So in the morning, first thing, when I get up, I'm sending you that prompt. So it'll be up in the morning sometime before 9 a.m. And then we'll discuss it again when we come back on Tuesday, okay? So until then, take care, stay healthy and safe and all that, and yeah, have a great weekend. Take care. Thank you. Thank you.